I don't know if anyone can see us or hear us
We
or
have
anything
zero.
like that.
We have 0 viewers, and we're currently on the starting soon. But
Right. Well, that's
and
that's
I'm.
not Clement.
But I'm going
It's a nice background. Lots of triangles. Very
Lots of
tricky.
triangle. This is very tricky. That's why I liked it.
Very tricky. Yeah, but green, which is not a creative color. Uh,
I love you, Cato.
that's sweet. Uh, very usable and sweet. Do you want to like go live? Can they hear our voices?
They can hear our voices.
Okay.
But let's go.
Hello.
Let's go proper live. And
Let's go proper live.
look at that, shiny.
Ooh, there's a 3D delay. Hello, welcome to What the Federation, a technical test stream where we talk about Star Trek and try and work out why our computers aren't working, which has
Exactly. It is a bit
I'll
weird.
be honest, the whole 20 minutes we've just had. What the tech as opposed to what the trek.
What the tech is indeed the correct answer to this situation.
Yeah. The answer is we don't know. We don't know why it wasn't working. We don't know why it's working now.
Exactly.
Who are you?
Me. I am Mitch. I'm Mitch, aka Kung Fu Panzer. Oh
and
man.
I'm Cato, aka Cato.
You are, and it looks like your camera's not working on the stream. Oh my god. Oh, there it goes. It just refreshed.
Oh, okay. Wow. Cool. Is my voice out of sync with my mouth? Oh dear.
Who knows?
That's a completely normal thing.
And at this point, we should, say hi to people and figure out what we're going to do.
Hello.
And also tweet out that we're live. I'm going to tweet that we're live. Because that's what professionals do.
Okay, you do that. I told some people in a Discord that we were live.
We are live.
I mean, I did what I could.
You did exactly what we needed to do.
I've done really anything. Everything anyone could ever ask of me, I have done now. And frankly, I'm just going to retire, rest on my laurels. Maybe start a vineyard in France, do what Picard was doing. I feel like that's valid.
That sounds nice.
Oh. I see people in chat saying hi to me,
are in chat.
which is very sweet. Yeah.
Oh my god. This is crazy.
Ooh, hi.
So, our lovely people in the chat, can you hear both of us?
I should sit up taller. Can you hear both of us?
I just want to double check.
There will be delay. Geek Out is suggesting that Picard cries with his brother on the mud. I was hoping to skip past that to like the happy retirement stage. I get called back for one last job and start a series that's just called Cato. That's the dream. That's
just the dream. So previously it was Cato, the South Australian generation.
Yeah. Cato, the first generation. Brilliant. Okay, and we have people confirming that we do have sound, which is amazing.
We do, which is excellent.
Now, for a stream that we started theoretically to talk about the basics of Star Trek, like before we even get into, tomorrow when we'll be talking about clear skies and all of the fun and exciting information we've had about that in the past little while, this was a stream that was meant to be just, the basics of Star Trek.
Just goofing.
We have made quite a lot of references to quite a lot of stuff that's fairly high level.
We did. But that's okay.
Definitely apologize. Yeah.
And we should probably start kind of the basic and then work into the more advanced things.
Sure. This is going to be interesting because I imagine our chat is full of people who know about Star Trek. So
probably, but for those who don't know about Star Trek, Cato, what is the Federation?
Oh, so the Federation is a united society formed of planets that kind of formed for collective common interest. And members are humans, Vulcans, who, if you know nothing about Star Trek, think of Vulcans as like elves, but in space. And those are the two big ones kind of at the start of Star Trek when it first kicks off back in the 60s. And since then, we've met lots more species that are members of the Federation and lots of species that aren't members of the Federation and have different relationships with the concept of Federation and kind of are opposing governments and opposing powers struggling in this world. But the Federation is, for want of a better word, our heroes. They're our point of view characters in Star Trek. They are this big group formed theoretically like a planetary United Nations. You can think of it all kind of working towards the common good and for lofty and philosophical goals rather than sort of profit and
for sure.
And
it doesn't always end out that way.
No, the Federation is certainly, it came from the mind of Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, and it was very much his vision of a future humanity that was a close to perfect society. And you can see that in early tracks of the original series. You can see the Federation has this organization within it called Starfleet, which is a fleet, like a fleet of ships, but in space, hence Starfleet, because they go through stars rather than, well, they go from star to star rather than from sort of land to land in an ocean. And Starfleet is this body of sort of scientific and exploration in Gene Roddenberry's mind. And it starts out that way. And really what happens in quite a lot of the original series is that they go to planets and they rule on moral conflicts that the planets are having. And you see the planets are suffering with racism or with the notion of morality as far as abortion goes and all these kind of big, heavy topics, or need medical aid or engineering understanding, or are being oppressed by a giant computer. And the Starfleet people, they go there and they fix the problem because they are this idealized version of society and this idealized version of humanity. And that's great. And it was really progressive for the time, but we've had many more Star Trek shows since then.
We have.
That kind of say, well, how good is the Federation really? How good is the Federation? And the answer is, well, maybe it's not so good. And I think that's a really nice evolution, because you get to sort of go, maybe we aren't entirely the good people that we want to be. And I think particularly, unfortunately, Gene Roddenberry's ideas for Star Trek, obviously being a white American, probably had some of the pitfalls you'd normally expect from white guys.
A little bit, yeah.
White Americans generally, to have that kind of white savior thing, exactly, and to sort of go to people who don't necessarily want your help and say, let me teach you to be better. When maybe that isn't what they want and isn't as welcome. So yeah, it's definitely grown into a more complex thing than just the perfect ideal that it was at the start.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's much more of a representation of people as opposed to idealized people. As we've come, especially when we go with DS9 and even further with the newer shows with Disco, there's a lot of pretty shady people involved.
Yeah, and we can talk about some of those shady people and why I happen to really dislike them and what they do and what they represent in the world. But to be honest, we actually got some questions from some people who, yes,
Geek House, Section 31.
Those are the people. I shall
we'll get
speak
there.
Their names right now.
I will. Consistently forever, Section 31.
Section 31 is the worst thing in any universe it exists in. It's just the worst.
Thank you for the follows. Helen and Lemon Twist.
Yeah. I just realized I'm not a mod in this chat, so everyone has to be really well behaved because no one can moderate you.
I can moderate everyone. I am the god.
No one can see you do whatever it is that bad people do in Twitch chat. But yeah, as I was saying, I reached out to some people that I knew struggle with Star Trek, but who wanted to sort of get on the board with Eric and the League of Whimsy and the Streampunks stories that they're going to tell in this world, to get those burning questions that we could talk about. So, do you want to hit me with the first one of those? Yeah,
well, I think we'll get into the weirder questions in a little bit.
Aww.
So, Starfleet, Federation, giant organization, we're getting a little bit more granular with ships. So, we're going to be on the USS Ross.
Yeah. I was kind of saving that for tomorrow because that's when we're going to talk about Clear Skies. I was thinking.
I was more talking about what is security, what is command, what is science, how is a ship broken down to its crew?
I really wanted you to ask me the question tomorrow because I have made an entire flowchart for this. I know, right?
We like flowcharts. Okay, we'll skip.
I do really love organizing. Basically, similar to how ships work in the modern day, you have a captain who's in charge of everything on the ship. They're the big boss. The only time that would ever change is if you had someone who was in charge of an entire fleet, and that person is usually an admiral or a commodore. They'd be on a ship. They'd technically be in charge of it. They'd have a captain under them sort of running things, but they're running an entire fleet, so they kind of like take a step back from the ship day-to-day affairs, but they're technically higher rank. Really specific circumstance, unlikely to happen basically ever. So yeah, you've got your captain on top. Then you have you have 3 groups within them, which are command, operations, and sciences, and those further subdivide till you get down to your sort of engineering, security, ops, sort of stuff. But I will have a flowchart, a lovely sort of color-coded thing tomorrow to tell you more about that. But basically, there's different departments. They do more or less what they say on the tin.
Yeah, it's going to be That's fair.
Mm.
So let's get into the actual questions then. Oh my gosh, faces. Exactly, Rofexive. We have faces. Surprisingly.
This is one of my favorite of the faces that I have, but I do have others.
That is a great question, Geek Outs. We will get to that in a moment. So, one, and this is a question I'd absolutely love to ask, but it completely cannot be answered. What's a Star Trek?
It's a trek between stars.
Damn it.
It's like a journey that you take within the stars. The central thesis of quite a lot of Star Trek is, or the original thesis was at least, that they were going to move between stars.
See, I was just being a jerk.
A 5-year mission of exploration, and then TNG has so the Next Generation, the second series, has another 5-year mission of exploration. And apart from one series, all of the others involve on some level that kind of trek exploration. Voyager obviously has the longest trek, the furthest distance to travel, takes the longest time. So it is the platonic ideal of Star Trek. And that is the answer to the question, which is the best Star Trek. It's Voyager. They go on the longest trek. They physically they have the most trek in their Star Trek. They also have the most stars because they go the furthest distance. And by that metric, which is the only correct metric, Voyager is the best Star Trek series.
It is the
there
most.
Is no other.
It's the most capital S
Nine,
star and most capital
exactly.
T Trek.
Trek, yeah. Deep Space Nine, widely thought to be the best Star Trek, weirdly, mainly set on a space station, do very little trekking through the stars. Obviously, the worst Star Trek. And
very poor.
As a sort of general disclaimer, for people who may not be familiar with Star Trek, Voyager has some of the most inconsistent writing. I wouldn't say it's the worst Star Trek, but it's not necessarily many people's favorites. It is my favorite. It's the best.
Cato is wrong. It is not the best.
Yeah, but Deep Space Nine is critically acclaimed and has some of the most complexity in Star Trek. So
For
obviously, when I was facetiously saying that because Voyager has the longest trek, it's the best trek, you can make your own opinions about that, but that was just me making a joke. I am trying to be accessible. I'm trying to be
Don't worry, we will be accessible.
Easy to understand. I'm actually trying not to use the word accessible for that because it has a very specific disability meaning. I'm trying to be approachable.
That is the correct term. Okay, so let's get into a little bit more of like linguistics and semantics, things that we get that Star Trek uses. It throws out its vocabulary kind of willy-nilly.
Yeah, I made a short list of things that might be important to people who don't know Star Trek. Things like vocabulary that they might need to pick up before Clear Skies. Star dates, for example, like dates, but star dates. And
how they differ from you can compare them to the regular solar dates, but they're not really useful.
Yeah. Nobody really. Well, people do use them. You'll often hear them at the start of like Captain's Log, Stardate X is there is a conversion. It's not entirely consistent. Basically, you can't use Earth dates because that's very much Earth-centric. It's not even Sol-centric, it's Earth-centric. And so they have this weird system of a star date that is meant to be a more universal, or at least Federation-centric way of numbering the dates. So that's what that means. Broadly, still higher numbers are bigger, are later in time chronologically. But
yeah, for sure.
It is easier to comprehend what happens in Star Trek if you convert everything back to Earth dates, because I live on a very Earth-centric planet. For whatever reason. So Clear Skies, for example, is taking place in 2381, which is 2381 as the Christian Earth calendar counts it, because it's even less universal than you think it is. But yes, that is what a star date is.
Alright, so it's used like every episode of Star Trek as well, which is just so annoying because it's such a useless thing. Whereas something actually useful, the quadrants. Alpha, beta, gamma, delta.
Yeah. So alpha and beta are the ones you probably need to concern yourself with in Clear Skies. Basically, if you think of a picture of the galaxy, I don't know if you can picture the galaxy, but imagine a big swirly shape with lots of stars, divided up into quadrants. Bottom left, that's the alpha quadrant. Earth is in that quadrant. Bottom right, that's the beta quadrant. The Shackleton expanse and registration, all of that stuff is in the beta quadrant. Broadly, the Federation, majority of the Federation's in the alpha quadrant. There's a tiny bit in the beta quadrant. And lots of your kind of big Trek species, so Klingons, if you've heard of those guys, Vulcans, Cardassians, they all come from either the alpha or beta quadrants. The gamma and delta quadrants only really get mentioned because of weird spatiotemporal fluctuations, basically. And so there are species that come from there that we know about and we've encountered in Star Trek series, but they're not as core and they're less likely to come up within the context of Clear Skies.
Yeah, for sure.
Yep.
So let's get a little bit more internal with the ship and its mechanics. Mm-hmm. Jefferies tubes. They are the excuse to like how engineering functions. What actually are they?
It's easy to think of them as like vents, but for a spaceship. So anytime any show that you've ever seen, someone tries to break in through the vents or does anything in the vents, Jefferies tubes are like the Star Trek version of a vent, essentially. So what normally happens is engineers go into the vents to try and fix things, and then they come out of the vents, and other stuff can get into the Jefferies tubes, essentially. But they're essentially just a complex of access panels and tubes. You can't really stand up in them. You normally have to sort of crawl on your hands and knees, but it's where you get access to all of the good stuff in engineering terms. So all of your pipes, all of your electricity will kind of be in there normally. And they're named after one of the designers for sort of early Star Trek ship layouts and things, a guy called Jefferies, and that he kept drawing these things on, and people were like, oh, those are Jefferies tubes. So they're actually not named after an engineer or anyone in canon, quote unquote, but they're named after one of the guys who worked on the set design, which I think is quite cool.
That is quite fun.
Yeah.
And what about a data pad or a pad?
Mm. Yeah, so PAD stands for Portable Auxiliary Data Display. It's like an iPad. It's like a tablet computer.
Yeah.
It's a pad that contains data. This was much harder to explain to people before tablets became a thing.
Yeah, it does help.
Yeah, much like a lot of Star Trek, there's data and technology that precedes the actual arising of it on Earth. So Star Trek had flip phones before we had flip phones, because back in the 60s they used a little mobile phone like device communicator to talk to the ship, and we took that and we went, that's a really cool idea, and then we made mobile phones. Similarly, Star Trek had data pads to carry huge amounts of data, and they would say something like, oh my gosh, it's got 30 books worth of data on it, back in the show.
And we would giggle.
Yeah, and now we giggle, but at the time, back in the day when data pads first were a thing, obviously that was revolutionary in the 60s to be like, there's this computer that's the size of a book and it carries ridiculous amounts of data on it. It's just that technology advanced a little bit faster than we were maybe expecting.
So generally, science department, they have the data pad in one hand and a tricorder in the other hand.
Yeah. Tricorders, it's probably easiest to think about a little bit like a sonic screwdriver that only does scans. It's a portable scanning device. It measures your stuff. And what does it measure? Well, that really depends on the plot needs of the week. So there's medical tricorders, which the medical folks use, which are all like very, very fancy and can do lots of high-tech medical checks, but your basic tricorder can also do quite a lot of basic medical checks. Plus it can scan for like radiation levels and energy signatures and heat and all that other stuff. So it's basically like a little scanning device in your pocket that allows you to find stuff.
Everything.
That's the most useful way to think about it.
For sure.
General.
Now, Cato. Outside of the standard tricorder, data pad, generally all Starfleet personnel are issued with a phaser.
Yeah, for something like all away missions, it is technically a part of Starfleet operating sort of code that they must take a phaser. Phasers are basically gun lasers. Or laser guns. So they're slightly cooler than regular guns in that they have a stun setting, and that you can kind of use them to heat objects up, or you can use the internal sort of battery of the phaser as a power source.
Yeah.
Which people do when they're trapped on planets alone and have to survive or keep warm and that kind of thing.
And it's very silly.
But yeah, essentially, it's a gun that allows the heroes not to kill anyone.
Exactly.
Cynically.
But there are also other types of phasers that can kill people.
Yeah, I mean, regular phasers can kill people, so they have lots of different settings. So you will often hear in particularly earlier Trek stuff like set phaser to stun, or if it's the baddies coming on board the ship, they'll say something like set phasers to kill, and you'll know that there's been an increase in tension because they're
going crazy.
Yeah.
We're not going to get into ship weapons geek outs because that's probably a little bit too complicated.
No, we're not going to get into ship weapons because we know Cato will talk about it for hours.
Yeah, and then honestly, I do need to sleep eventually.
Yeah, theoretically.
So that's kind of all the handheld things for our good Starfleet.
There is technically the communicator.
So yeah, the comm badge.
Basically a comm badge is the TNG and after thing. It's a little badge. It looks like this. Da, 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 da. On everyone's shirts, they can press it and go beep beep, and they will be put in contact with whoever they say they're looking for. So you can go beep beep, get me the captain, and the captain will be like, yeah, what do you want? Why are you telephoning me? I'm in the bath.
Please leave.
And yeah, so that is basically the more updated version of that flip phone mobile communicator
sure.
I was talking about before. And they are also pretty cool. They've got a little bit of tech inside them, again, kind of by needs of the week. If you're really isolated and stuck, you can use a little bit of the tech in there to do other things. But yeah, again, a kind of a little bit needs of the week thing. Broadly, they can communicate live to your ship if your ship is in near orbit. The further away your ship goes from the planet, assuming you're being left behind, the harder it is for you to communicate, and at some point communications will drop out, which is the source of many a plot, as you can imagine.
So many plots. So that's a good, like, this is like kind of whatever all the Starfleet people have, and that's also kind of like what Starfleet people do.
Some more complicated question. What does Starfleet do?
What does Starfleet do? And it kind of boils down to kind of the Starfleet kind of code of conduct, and more importantly, your boy, the Prime Directive.
Yes, the Prime Directive, Starfleet General Order 1, or the Non-Interference Directive.
And some captains are much more involved with this than others.
Yeah, this is your broadest source of tension, I think, within the series, which is this idea that you are not meant to interfere with species without their consent, and you're definitely not meant to interfere with the development of pre-warp species. So species that haven't reached a certain technology level, the Federation has decided they won't intervene with their development. And that means if their sun's going to blow up and they're all going to burn up, that's fine. That's just what has to happen. And it's a choice the Federation has made, broadly probably because it's a bit like playing God. If you wander along to what we would consider a Stone Age civilization and say, hey guys, your planet's going to die, let's remove you and put you on another planet. And there's probably, particularly given how populous the universe is in Star Trek and how many suns have planets that support life in some form, it probably is a sensible choice because it's something that comes up all the time, apparently.
Absolutely.
And you have to make the decision. But obviously, nobody likes to see heroes callously going, we'll just let these people burn and die, or we just won't deliver medicine to these people who desperately need it because they're, medieval equivalent and they have this horrible plague. So you often see captains grappling with that and trying to work out what the ethics of that are.
A big source of conflict.
Yeah. Particularly if you add in stuff like anthropology and trying to observe how the species are developing without interfering with their development and stuff like that. So it's a big moral issue, and it doesn't just stop at warp capable species. It's kind of a general rule about not showing up with a lot of technology and going, hey, we can advance your species this much with our technology in exchange for something we want. It's a big thing, and I would say broadly everyone breaks the Prime Directive at least once because it's just such a huge way to tell stories. Obviously, Janeway, the captain in Voyager, ends up totally isolated, totally far away from the Federation with no resources, and is put in a very different situation, and so tends to break the Prime Directive more just because she has literally no other option most of the time.
Yeah, when you're in the shitter. So you mentioned a word in there. Also, yes, Ejafet worship the Picard. He's so good. Yeah. That boy loves the Prime Directive. But you mentioned a word in there. Warp capable.
Maybe a reference. Sorry, I just want to, because basically the people that are in our chat right now are not the people that need Trek explaining to them.
No.
You're all lovely and brilliant, but you do seem to know what Trek is. I believe there's also at least one episode where people do actually end up worshipping Picard, because pre-warp civilizations can be very susceptible to suggestion.
They can be.
And that is probably what that's referencing. You wanted to get on me about warp?
Yeah, what is warp capable?
Okay. So warp is the Star Trek term for the thing that ships do when they go faster than light. It's about the sort of capacity to go faster than light. So you have to be able to achieve faster than light speeds, warp speeds as they're called, in order to be considered kind of on par with the rest of the galaxy as far as development, because that means you can leave your star at a speed enough to get to the next planet over and to make contact with another species. Broadly, there's this complicated thing where your ship leaves space and goes into subspace when you warp, and that's how you can travel much faster than light. Warp tends to go from warp factor 1, which is, I think, light speed, or it's some variant of light speed. It goes up to 10. 10 is the theoretical limit. 10 is meant to be infinite speed. You are simultaneously at every point in the galaxy at once. And so you have this weird asymptotic graph where the closer you get, warp 9, warp 9.9, warp 9.975 gets closer and closer, but never actually reaches that point of actually achieving the ability to travel to any point in the known universe simultaneously. Technically, even 9.975 is actually much slower than that, which is how you get Voyager technically able to reach those speeds at points during the series. Still doesn't actually get back across even our galaxy in less than several years without like massive sort of stuff. So yeah, there's this. Basically, warp is the magic tech word they use to describe the ability to go faster than light.
Yeah. And a warp-capable society is someone that can do that. For example, the Federation.
Yeah. And then the other thing that comes with that is subspace, which is the place you end up when you warp, which is this weird not space where the rules are different and what can and can't happen to you is different. So lots of really dangerous stuff happens. So you're not meant to be able to beam onto ships when they're at warp. You're not meant to be able to fight effectively with ships when they're at warp. You can just sort of chase them. You shouldn't detach your ship when it's at warp because very dangerous things can happen. But it's also how you get faster than light communications. So lots of communication in Star Trek is much faster than it would be with the technology we have right now on Earth. So it takes us a long time to get a signal moving at light speed to and from, say, all of our satellites, for example. In Star Trek, that isn't a problem. You can basically have a video call, like a Skype call or anything, with someone who is way, way far away because they have the capacity to send messages at much faster than the speeds of light and much faster than even how fast the ships can travel effectively. And there is some rules about the distance you have to be before you need a booster to speed up the signal and all that sort of stuff. But again, it gets very hand wavy and they don't necessarily pay the attention to it that they should. Oh, just while we're there, the warp curve was drawn by someone on the back of a napkin. It's not very scientific. How fast warp 6 is compared to warp 2 compared to warp 9 does not follow any logical, scientific, mathematical progression. If you can find an equation that describes the warp curve in any way, I will love you forever because an artist drew it and did not base it on good maths. Please fix that for me, Internet. It is so frustrating.
It will never happen, Cato.
I tried so hard. It's just not.
And you got so far, but in the end.
One of the interesting problems with Star Trek is that although lots of really clever and intelligent and scientifically interested people worked in the show at various points and thought about some elements of how this ultra high-tech society could work, what didn't necessarily happen is that they thought about all of it. And so sometimes an artist would just come along and be like, yeah, I'm going to draw that in or I'm going to add this in. And then you get problems like the warp curve, which makes no sense and doesn't work and is not mathematically accurate because an artist drew it as opposed to a mathematician sat down and went, oh, yeah, this is kind of how you would describe that. So yeah, that is one of the things is that it doesn't necessarily make sense.
For sure.
Excuse me. Cool. People, that was my housemate trying to make a cameo on stream to give me food.
How dare? How dare?
I know. I don't need to eat. Eating is for humans.
Exactly.
And they're disgusting, meaty bodies.
And Cato clearly is not a human. So you can explain what the hell LCARS is.
Library Computer Access Retrieval System.
Because even at this point, I don't get it.
it is basically it's the graphical interface they use on the Next Generation. If you picture what a Star Trek computer looks like, the sort of black background with the orange and the blue sort of light up colors and the very simplified diagrams, that's kind of how that's meant to work. That's what an LCAR is, but it's sort of used to describe just how you put in the background lots of sort of beautiful screens that are black with with orange light up text and then sort of white text and stuff. That's what that is. It's all the pretty computer screens that you put around. That's what an LCAR is. And it stands, as I said, for Library Computer Access Retrieval System, which makes no sense. Nah. But yeah,
those are definitely 5 words in an order.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it mostly works, but it's so stupid.
Anyway, that's what
it's Trek nonsense.
Trek.
And finally, from a kind of language and words vocabulary, dilithium.
Dilithium is what powers starships. It's one of the sort of core essential materials that you need in order to run a warp core and get your ship going at faster than light speeds. The warp core is the central engine for ships. It's both the thing that allows you to move at warp speeds, but it also tends to provide lots of power, and it works through radiation, I guess, probably. And there are lots of other sort of words where there are fictional materials that are injected and supplied to this reactor, and that generates energy that A, allows you to go to warp, but B, allows you to have a functioning ship, which is how they're not out there burning coal or sort of being solar powered or anything like that. They have this warp reactor, warp core powered by dilithium crystals doing something. Dilithium is a real thing. That is not the same as the Star Trek dilithium. Those are 2 different things.
For sure. They're not...
Yeah, no organic chemist should worry about the fact that dilithium definitely doesn't work how it works in Star Trek. Dilithium is a whole different thing. And it's the most important of the fictional materials that are actually scarce in Star Trek.
Oh, yeah. And especially considering that Star Trek is set in a post-scarcity age.
Yeah. That's really funny, because that's one of the questions that was put to me when I was like, what are some questions that you might ask about Star Trek? Was why does nobody have any money? What's up with that? And I find that question really fascinating, to be honest, because the answer is Gene Roddenberry, when dreaming up a perfect future world, went for a post-scarcity world that was post-capitalism, and designed a world where people didn't have wants or needs, but pursued exploration and scientific sort of furtherment for a philosophical dream. And that he dreamt of a world that was sort of past the need for money. And, no one in Starfleet is working because they need money. They're all meant to be working because they believe in the ideals of Starfleet and they believe in discovering stuff. And that's a really beautiful dream. And
it's really great.
I find it fascinating how many people just can't deal with the idea that there's no money, and how much that is something someone bumps on, because there's faster than light travel, which is very difficult to achieve and might be physically impossible, and yet the problem you have is that money doesn't exist, which is really interesting, and I think says a lot about kind of how entrenched some aspects of our society are. Because
mind reading aliens, no money.
Oh yeah, I didn't even think about that. Not aliens have telepathy. I'm not sure whether or not I believe in telepathy. Scientifically, I don't think it's very possible.
But there are a lot of alien species that have the capability of reading minds and talking to you in your mind.
Yeah, and yet, money is the problem that people have with this
Obviously,
show.
That is clearly false.
That's the point where this gets unreasonable. But yeah, basically, the Federation doesn't tend to have money or use money because basically everything any Federation citizen could want should be available to them freely. They have replicated technology, so they can basically make anything at any time at a minimum energy cost, unless you happen to be, for example, Voyager, which is obviously a ship that got stranded far away from anything else, had a very limited supply of fuels like dilithium. And so Voyager ends up in this sort of scarcity economy where they trade things like replicator rations and holodeck rations, where basically they're saying everyone on the ship essentially has an energy credit. So they have a credit for how much energy they can use up to make the replicator go. And so if you want if you want a particularly nice food, for example, you have to spend more replicator credits to make it. And so you have
absolutely.
that kind of trading, very sort of barter-based economy of trading credits and that sort of thing, because broadly they were trying to save that energy and conserve it. But it's not very common. Similarly, they do have sort of credits for going down to planets that still use some form of currency, which is presumably like Federation credit in the sense of saying, we'll take this from you and we'll give you this amount of Federation credit, so you can come to the Federation later on and go, I'd like to spend these credits. What can I sort of get for that? As a way of kind of having an interface with species that are still using.
Yeah, for sure. Good old Latinum.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Latinum is one of the big actual currencies that is used. So the Ferengi particularly, and lots of the other species tend to trade in Latinum, or gold pressed Latinum. Gold is not the important part of it, it's the Latinum. The Latinum is what is valuable. The gold is considered worthless because it is so abundant. And I think, again, Latinum is just a thing that has rarity. And much like gold today, gold is sort of useful, but not very useful in sort of modern human society. But it's reasonably scarce, so you can use it as a foundation for a currency fairly easily because it's not going to change in value very much because there's a limited amount of it. And so it theoretically can underpin lots of economies. Similarly, Latinum, not very useful, not good for doing anything with.
It has just been ascribed value.
Yeah, a stable amount of it in the galaxy, so therefore can be ascribed a value and won't fluctuate very much.
Thank you for following Gemini Lightning. So before we get into more of those weird kind of what the Federation questions, I want to chat a little bit about the antagonists in the world of Star Trek.
Okay. All right. Hubris. Greed.
Less moral antagonists.
I won't mention.
Yeah, the people you won't mention. I'm more talking about some of the encountering species that we have that oppose Starfleet.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the biggest one that we're going to be ending up dealing with, seeing as they're currently at peace with the Federation, is the Klingons.
Yeah. So, again, this is interesting. The big species are probably fairly familiar to anyone. So the most foundational are the Klingons and the Romulans, both of whom were created back in the original series days, and again exist to form a sort of military conflict with the Federation. The Klingons are, think of them like space orcs. They're a combination of space orcs, I would argue, with sort of Japanese feudalism. And that's the kind of the high sort of caste-based warrior society that they have going on. And they're big and brown-skinned, and they fight a lot, so they're orcs. And you know, and that's kind of the role they occupy in the world. And that was kind of how they first started out. Since then, obviously, there have been loads of Star Trek series, and Klingon has developed from a somewhat stereotyped species that exists to be an enemy to a species with a lot of complexity, with a lot of its own sort of culture. There is a constructed language for Klingon, and they have evolved properly to sort of become their own species and their own thing, and they have a lot more complexity than just that fundamental level.
Yeah, for sure.
But those are the basics, and those are kind of like the basics you need to be able to sort of grapple with what role they occupy in the world. Is that they started out like that, and they become
much
more complicated.
And what about the Holy Roman Empire?
So you mean the Romulans, the Romulan Star Empire. And the Romulan Star Empire are the Russians by way of the ancient Romans. So again, like the original series started back in the 60s, and it was very much about, in the same way that all sci-fi is actually about the modern day and is a reflection of the modern day sort of concerns and fears. You have these two species that are very much, these two alien species that are designed to present the 60s American viewer with an idea of who their enemies are, with a sort of notion of the Romulans as this very interesting empire if you look at the history of the Romulans, it is the history of the Roman Empire.
It's great.
If you just read the history of the Roman Empire, you will have a really good understanding of what the Romulans are about. Generally, they're an empire. They have a senate. They have all this complicated voting structure. They're very sort of pride-based. They are like Vulcan's evil cousins, so they look like Vulcans. They've got the pointy ears. They've also got the space elf thing going on, but they are more sinister and darker and meaner. But they are where the Klingons are, and the Klingons are not. But where the Klingons were brutish and tough and aggressive, the Romulans are cultured and thoughtful and cunning enemies, and that's kind of how they have grown. But again, huge amounts of complexity have gone into them over the years. They have developed into more than just that stereotype. But that is kind of broadly what you need to understand where they are in the universe and what their role is broadly.
For sure. And kind of the other one, which I hope we'll interact with, but there's no guarantees, is the Borg.
So the Borg are very, very interesting. The Borg are a little bit later on, so they sort of appear in The Next Generation is when they're sort of first founded as an antagonist, and they are about technology that has become sinister, and they are a sort of technological hive mind, and they are very complicated because theoretically they are a consensus-led hive mind that is formed by a fusion of organic and technological parts. So all of the Borg have an organic underlying, and then the organic did have a life, presumably, was taken and converted into Borg. So they had implants put in their brain, they had parts of their organic body replaced with technology, and they were connected to the hive mind link up of the Borg. And they go around taking species that have biological things that would give them an advantage and trying to integrate that into their society. There are some Borg who are born organically and grown and live their entire lives connected to technology. But the big sinister thing is the idea that they can come and take someone and convert them into one of them, and that person will have their will, their independence subsumed by the hive mind and the hive mind's control, and sort of give into the dominating desires of the Borg, which are never really explained.
Yeah, and then the Queen happened and things got weird.
Yeah, and then theoretically, sometimes there is also the Borg Queen, who, again, if you're thinking of them as like a hive mind, the Borg Queen is your Queen Bee kind of character, who is theoretically making decisions and can be quite spitefully motivated. And lots of people who are very big fans of the Borg think that the Borg Queen does not add much to their mystique, in that she takes
really
a true hive mind that makes consensus-led decisions and gives them an authority figure and a head. But she's real sexy, and she has some nice, interesting conflicts with various captains over the years. So some people may value
lots
her
of fun
more than others. Yeah.
And I think Jaffet brings up a good point with we've just left the Dominion War.
Yeah, it's been a little while in 2381. The Dominion are another Federation-like collective of species. So the Borg is a collective in a sense that they use lots of different organic species to underlie their technology, but theoretically they're all Borg once they've been converted. And
they actively collect.
Yeah. Whereas the Federation, there is still some independence. So the Federation species don't all become Federation predominantly. They all remain theoretically individual, but with a collective kind of goal. And yes, and then the Dominion is another one of those sort of groups where you have a government formed theoretically containing multiple other different species within them. The big headlines for the Dominion are they are ruled by some species who I can't remember what they're called, but they are the changelings functionally. I can't remember what their other name is.
The Founders.
Yeah, Founders. And they can turn into anything, organic or not, and perfectly replicate it, and you won't be able to detect it on a scan. Obviously, with plot, you can adapt your scan to detect them, but they're meant to be really difficult to detect. So they can impersonate you, they can impersonate me, they can impersonate a pot plant. That's their kind of level. And they are from a different quadrant, and they come through the wormhole into the Alpha and Beta quadrant, and they can basically be anywhere. So they're a big highlight, and they're scary because you don't know who they are. They are the fear of the sleeper agent in your town. They are the fear that your enemies are not in another country somewhere, but they're actually here in our places, in our towns. They're the fear of that kind of level of infiltration and spying is what they represent as a species. Below them, they have very highly advanced foot soldiers who are the Jem'Hadar. These guys, they're broadly all sort of masculine characterized. They're big lizards. They have a drug dependency, and so they are made to rely on this drug in order to survive, and the drug gets them more amped up for fighting. They're bigger and scarier than the Klingons, but they are dependent on this drug to survive, and therefore dependent on the goodwill of the Dominion and the support of the founders. And this makes them ruthlessly loyal, ruthlessly committed, very, very willing to die to further the Dominion's the Dominion, because like if they don't, they will be cut off from their supply of the drug, which is called Ketracel White, or just the White. If they're cut off from that, then they die. So they have this kind of, again, a very entrenched reason to serve. And again, I think we can see kind of they're again a later species. They kind of come up in Deep Space Nine mainly, and you can see that late 90s, early 2000s kind of paranoia in the American psyche that started to build into these characters, like this idea that our enemies, even if they philosophically agreed with us, they are forced to fight. This fear of extremism, of being really committed, and also this fear of infiltration that our enemies are inside us. I don't think those are necessarily good attitudes to have, but I think they are reflective of how America was at that time and probably still is, and that's why they're such good antagonists, because they're very reflective of the fears of a society at the time. The other big group to mention in the Dominion are the Vorta, who are the spokespeople. They've got fun elf ears, but they're even cooler. And they're a series of clones that speak for the founders. And they tend to turn up by themselves or with a group of Jem'Hadar. And they just talk, and they're just annoying and smarmy.
It's great.
Probably on some level also spies. But they're just really charismatic. They talk, they make very reasonable arguments for the founders, for these changelings, because again, the changelings tend not to want to appear themselves broadly. They tend to be very sort of hands-off and let the groups of people that they have controlled and have control over do all of their dirty work for them. And again, I think that ability to speak your way into and out of situations, to be very diplomatic, I think probably there's some level of American dislike of diplomacy. Maybe you could argue there. Some subconscious thing about the idea that people are able to talk their way into and out of the good graces of other governments, and that this is bad and scary, because we know ultimately that the Dominion does not have good intentions towards our quadrant, because we know that the changelings broadly, with the exception, because obviously there's an exception, that there's one good changeling in Star Trek who's the character Odo from Deep Space Nine, who doesn't know he's a changeling, effectively doesn't know that he's got this family and this connection, and so is just trying to figure out who he is in his life. Broadly, the changelings are very fearful and hateful of organics who don't change, and take this proactive policy of aggression in order to defend themselves, because they feel that they cannot be trusted. Organics won't ever trust them, and so they perpetuate the cycle where they have to oppress people and bring them into the Dominion in order to defend themselves, because they feel that they will be attacked if they don't.
Which sucks.
Does that explain the Dominion?
I think that gives a good overview of the Dominion, and I think especially considering that the Dominion are essentially gone in the setting where we're going to be.
Yeah.
It's just good to know a little bit of history.
Yeah. So the big war with the Dominion War was obviously a big, very paranoid war. Tomorrow I'm going to try and get into a little bit more about what happened, because lots of what happened with the Dominion War was that it was ultimately an invasion from another part of the galaxy into the Alpha and Beta quadrants through this wormhole. And kind of one of the big points of it was that at various points the Federation was by itself against the Dominion, and other Alpha and Beta quadrant species were actually joining with the Dominion and saying, these guys are such a big threat, we feel like actually we're better off joining them now and kind of getting something good out of this. So it created a lot of conflict and a lot of unrest that is still kind of being dealt with, because yes, the wormhole has been closed, the Dominion have been cut off, they can no longer get in, but that has still left us with this point where actually some of those species, like the Cardassians, fought with the Dominion for a long time. So how can we trust the Cardassians now, because they were fighting with these other people to invade us a little while ago, and so there's lots of conflict there that I think will come up probably in the course of Clear Skies.
For sure.
And it's also worth noting that there are still some still some changelings in the Alpha Quadrant, as far as I can tell, 2381, and that some of them may eventually be caught and extradited and sort of charged for war crimes and for various other things. So that is still an ongoing process, because although very few of them actually came through to do spying, because if you get change your shape all the time, it's really easy to effectively spy just a lot.
Yeah,
but
just a whole bunch.
There are probably still a couple around, and they're probably not very happy because they just got essentially lost a war and got cut off from their entire species. So there's still a threat, and that paranoia probably won't go away for a while. The idea that even someone you trust, if they start acting differently, they can have changed. They could have been totally replaced by someone else.
Absolutely, and it kind of did turn the shows into a bit more of a military drama, political intrigue, and mystery into the show as well, which is always great because Star Trek is always changing its tone and doing weird, fun new things. But let's talk about some stupid Star Trek stuff.
Oh, okay.
So Cato, the Star Trek has always been about some good style and outfits.
Yeah, there are some really good looks.
There are some top looks. I particularly am quite fond of the disco outfits.
The disco outfits are unfairly good.
They're really nice. The medical white.
It's not a good. It's just bad color for medicine. There's lots of blood in medicine. There's lots of other substances in medicine. Why would you put everyone in white?
They should be in black. Doesn't matter.
Yeah, they'd be any other color.
But otherwise, they look really nice and real trim.
Yeah.
But But Cato, why are there no pockets?
Pockets look dumb, and belts are futuristic, and costume departments feel this way, and therefore pockets. Broadly, some outfits do have pockets. The Federation uniforms generally do not. There are a couple of things that were decided at the beginning, like there shouldn't be any visible zips or joins, because everything in the future should fit you perfectly, because it's been designed for your body, so you don't need to wear anything like a zip for whatever reason, because it's just a perfect
But then why
fit.
are belts a thing?
Belts are a thing to hold all your stuff, because belts look futuristic in the 60s.
Oh, man.
And since then, it's been a thing. There are obviously garments that have belts, and some of those garments were created to hide the pregnancies of certain women on the casts, which is a bad way to get pockets, but at least a reversal of the general kind of trend, which is that women don't get pockets and men do. Fashion designers, I don't understand why. This is a general problem. Fashion designers hate pockets. It's a problem in the real world. It's also a problem in Star Trek, because costume designers, even if they're designing for futuristic series, still hate pockets.
Yeah, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But oh well. They can figure that stuff out. So there is we've already talked about one of our other notes. But, So there's this interesting thing that happens in Starfleet, in that it is both really good for people who want to express their individuality and their own cultures, but also really terrible with people expressing their individuality and their cultures. So the major one is you can look at TNG and DS9 with Worf, who is allowed to wear his Klingon bandolier, but all the Bajorans, specifically TNG, because there are some jerks in the crew, don't let them wear their earrings, which are the traditional religious garbs.
Yeah. So technically, this is not an inconsistency, because the rule is that you're not meant to wear anything outside of the official Starfleet uniform code. Worf's belt, sash, is outside of the official Starfleet uniform code. Rolaren, who is the first Bajoran we meet in kind of early TNG, is not allowed to wear her earring, because it is also outside of the official uniform code. There is no exception for sort of religious garments or garments of cultural significance within the uniform code, as written. Your captain is allowed to make special dispensations to say, yeah, that's fine, you can wear that, even though it's not technically allowed. Picard obviously does this for Worf, because he knows Worf. He's known Worf for years before he gets the bandolier. They have a good working relationship. He understands the significance of it. So he makes a sort of a choice, basically, because he knows Worf. Worf is his friend, and he's happy to relax the rules. And Picard is generally somewhat uptight as a captain when it comes to things like rules and decorum, because it's Patrick Stewart pretending to be an 18th century naval officer, pretending to be a 24th century Starfleet officer. So that's why he's kind of a bit uptight. When it comes to Rolaren, she is from a species they don't know. She's a member of a religion they don't necessarily know or understand. And so you have this kind of initial conflict where they don't get why it's important or what the significance is. And also they don't have a relationship with her. So they make it a much more sort of blunt decision to go, no, that's not acceptable. I think just because of prejudice, Worf is their friend,
sure.
so therefore Worf gets to do the cool thing. Rolaren is not their friend and is kind of abrasive, so they decide against that. As Bajorans gradually assimilate into the Federation becomes more understanding and respectful of their culture, and so you are starting to see more acceptance of the idea that the Bajorans will wear earrings. But it takes a long time, and as far as I'm aware, there's never been an official, at this point the Federation stopped, pulled that stick out of their ass and decided, yeah, it's fine, you can wear your earrings. It's actually kind of reflective of a broader problem in Star Trek, which is that in Gene Roddenberry's head, the idealistic future that he imagined was an atheist one. There wasn't any religion in early Star Trek. The species, the humans particularly, did not have religion. And this is despite the fact he was imagining a world where a Russian character and a Japanese character and a black woman from Africa could all be part of a team, still led by white men from America, but part of a team and considered to be contributing. He thought that religion was actually kind of one of the big barriers to coexistence and cohesion. And for that reason, there are no humans with faith in Star Trek particularly. There are humans that broadly believe in the notion of a god, but a very soft Protestant atheist god.
It's really interesting, because there's a lot of people out there, especially people of color, Muslims, Jews, that don't get super well represented. It's like we don't really see any hijab-wearing Starfleet officers.
We should.
We should, absolutely. So I'm reminded of Blair Amani on Twitter, who has that stunning hijab Starfleet outfit that is just like, this looks so baller.
There are some really amazing Geordie cosplays where you have like hijabi Geordie.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, this is a really big problem, I think, because the any image of the future that is imagined by one person is going to be limited by their notion of what true happiness is and what the best thing for everyone is. You need to have a collaborative vision of the future where everyone is included, everyone gets involved. And I think that atheists from a Christian background have a difficulty understanding the importance of faith as a cultural thing. Even if we accept the idea that no one in the 24th century believes in God, I don't think that would get rid of Jewish people. There are lots of Jewish people who don't believe in God, but who nevertheless are Jewish and will be culturally Jewish and will follow Jewish traditions and will wear Jewish clothes and keep Jewish law, because that is a cultural thing as much as it is about a relationship with God. And I think that is true. I think that's probably true for Sikhs and Muslims as well. I think, and trying to take that away and repress it is actually part of a homogenizing white Protestant force to try and remove sort of culture and religion. And in that same way, where we talked about, having a Russian character and a Japanese character in the middle of the Cold War, just after World War II, when these are the big kind of enemies of America, having them in their world was important. Similarly, right now, when the US is engaged with brinkmanship with Iran, and when there's so much hate and prejudice directed at people who are visibly religious and visibly brown, so Sikhs wearing headdresses, hijab wearing Muslim women, anyone who visibly has a faith that is not Christian, those are the people that should be in Star Trek. They should be represented, and we should say the future includes these people. These people are just as much part of a good future, the positive future that Star Trek is imagining, as Protestants or atheists.
Absolutely. And we have great things like Clear Skies, where people bring forward these beautiful new identities.
Yeah. It's my pet peeve with Star Trek, is the religion thing. It makes me so furious.
There are a lot of problems with Star Trek. That is one of them. And we always want to try and make the things we love better.
For sure.
So I think outside of what we've discussed already, is there anything else you think is vital Star Trek knowledge?
No, but I know a lot of Star Trek, so I suspect what I think is vital